Hush, little baby, don't you cry. You know your mother's bound to die. All my trials, Lord, soon be over. Too late, my brothers, too late, but never mind. All my trials, Lord, soon be over. I remember.
I'm Dan Botkin, and I had a long career as an environmental scientist and did a lot of important projects for various states, including problems with endangered species. But now I've returned to my roots, which include folk music, because my father, Ben Botkin, was a major folklorist. And I grew up around folk songs, made my first folk song record when I was 6.5. In 2012, the Library of Congress listed the 100 books that have shaped America. And my father's book, A Treasure of American Folklore, was one of those 100. I've returned to my roots singing folk songs. Like wine, he'll drink your blood like wine. If that train runs me right, gonna be home tomorrow night. 'Cause I'm 900 miles from my home. I grew up in a home where major folk musicians came all the time. Pete Seeger, other ones who I'll talk about, and they would come and play. And I was fascinated by that music, and I find a lot of solace in folk music. So when times are troubled, I go for long walks, and in my head I sing folk songs. But we live in a very odd time. Today, we have a difficult America with lots of disagreements. And in past times, there were always difficult times in which people turned to folk music, including protest songs. And we have the difficulties and the disagreements, but nobody pays much attention to folk music. So my goal now is, first of all, to enjoy playing folk music, but also try to get folk music more popular so it can help us become one people. There's a number of key people who have been my musical influences. One of the most important, of course, was Pete Seeger, who was a family friend, became a lifetime friend of me. And he would come and give concerts. My goodness, those were amazing concerts because he had this ability to make an audience do whatever he wanted. If he wanted them to sing, they'd always sing. He had this charisma, and I sat there ever since I was a child trying to figure out what in the world that charisma was. I never did. But whenever he got on stage, he was in charge. Another important person was Alan Lomax, who with his father did a lot of traveling in America and discovered some of the great folk singers, including black folk musicians, some of whom they brought to the big cities of the United States and made stars. There was a young woman, Ellen Steckert, who came to our home. She was working on a PhD in folklore, but she also sang very nicely. And she and I became very good friends. And one day she walked in and she said, "Dan, you're playing these classical music instruments, clarinet, you're playing the saxophone. you've got to get with it. You're alive with folk music. So she threw me a guitar and a banjo and said, take this upstairs and learn. And she showed me how to start playing. So that had a big influence on me. Folk music is so important to human societies, but isn't part of our modern American society very much. It's way in the background. Although it was popular in the 19th century, big time popular in the 20th century with a family called the Carter family that dug out folk songs, created folk songs, borrowed folk songs. The father of the family worked with a black musician named Leslie Riddle, a blues musician, and they would do anything they could to create folk songs, and that was in the 1920s. Some of the early recordings made worldwide popularity. And then in the 1950s and 60s, the folk music was very alive in New York City and San Francisco, and people were exploring different approaches. That, of course, led to Bob Dylan and to rock and roll becoming much more important, and country and bluegrass music. So it was very popular in those days. But today it's faded. There's just a few people like myself that are deeply involved with folk music and believe it saves our lives. And when I did go to make a record of my own, a CD, where I told stories about folk songs and then sang them, the video producer said, Dan, you've got to do a lot more with this. I said, really? I thought this was just for home. He said, no. So we got talking. And we would spend time in a room with lots of other guitarists just waiting around. And in that room, there was peacefulness, whereas outside in America, there was discordancy. And so we decided that we would call our project What Makes Us One, because folk music does bring us together in peace and does help us overcome these differences. I've published 16 books. Most of them were about environment one way or another. I had a textbook with a co-author, Ed Keller, a geologist, that went through 9 editions over 20 years and was considered the most solid scientifically and also one of the most readable textbooks. The novel I wrote is called Savo. Oddball researchers use data and guns to save African elephants. The book takes place in an actual national park called Savo. But I felt it was very important for our time to write about people and nature. Now today, with our scientific knowledge about nature, we know more about nature than any other civilization has known. But we are also the most confused about what nature means to us and how people fit into nature. I've done wilderness research all over the world, and when you get into wilderness, you meet very odd characters. It turns out, as I think about them, that these are people who couldn't fit into normal civilized society of human beings. And so they retreat to wilderness. Everything that poor boy had, if that train runs me right, gonna be home Saturday night. I think we are fortunate to live in this country. But many things disturb me about what's going on, about as I've mentioned, the huge disagreement among peoples with some very harsh anger and threats from one side and from the other side in almost all aspects of our lives. This is the discordantness that's going on right now. It has to do with race relations, women's role, and many other things. And we're all aware of this from the news on television and in the newspapers. But we have to find our way out of it. It's really, we think of it as the ordinary kind of society, but actually our kind of democracy has rarely existed in the history of our species. And we are likely, if we don't pay attention, to become that kind of non-rational, non-democratic society. So that's very, very important. And I do everything I can to try to help protect democracy. You know, I'm just one person, so I'm not claiming that I've done a huge amount of success, but I've tried very hard.